Welcome, amigos. This is Maria. I'm Maria Cardona, your host, and I'm here with Andrea Mares, our co-host, and we're thrilled to welcome to the program Dr. Griselda Rodríguez-Solomon of Brujas of Brooklyn. Griselda, thank you so much for being on, Maria, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So you started Brujas of Brooklyn. Tell us what that means. Are you actually a witch?
So, yes, for those that are asking, bruja is the Spanish word for witch. And it's a wellness platform that my twin sister Miguelina and I started around 5 years ago. And yes, I do consider myself a bruja, very politicized and very historical reason why we are reclaiming this word.
Yes, and to elaborate on that, I think that religion and spirituality play a very important role in resistance, right? So could you speak to how your platform has kind of extended on that?
Yeah, so historically, I'm a professor of sociology and gender studies. So I've taught and I look at the history of the role that the witch has played in colonial domination. And in Western Europe and parts of the Americas, very powerful women, outspoken women were deemed to be witches, especially those that defied the more European, Eurocentric religions, and they were burned at the stake and they were demonized. So my sister and I, like, we're not the first, so many others have chosen to reclaim that word and that identity from history and reframed it to really center the reality that a woman that is in tune with her power, a person that is clear on who they are and is unapologetic, and also is very much centered on the fact that we believe in God and we use God as a guide, and nature as well. That's a bruja. So brujas are very much politically active, and for the Brujas of Brooklyn, our spirituality very much a form of resistance to dehumanization.
You know, Griselda, I was so looking forward to this conversation because I'm a practicing Catholic, but I have always been drawn to the broader spirituality that we see in nature, for example, in our environment, in Mother Earth. And I do think that that comes from a rich Latino tradition that Reverend Cortez was talking about, ironically enough. So, Griselda, tell us the difference between religion, faith, and spirituality.
Yeah, that's a great question that we get asked a lot, and I'll start with the commonalities. So one major thing that these different aspects of faith have in common is we all believe in God. People that are spirit based are very much believing in God. I think that people that are spiritual, like my sister and myself and millions of others around the world, we believe that we can and we have the right to honor God or other spiritual entities without having to be confined to certain dogmas or rules. I was raised Roman Catholic. I did a lot of my sacraments, and so I have that foundation which I still go to in certain moments and I still honor and believe. It's just that people that are spiritual are also aware of the political implications of certain organized religions and their role in silencing and oppressing communities such as folks of color, women, queer folks. So I think that people, generally speaking, at least for my sister and myself, that claim a more spirit based engagement with God also understand that certain religions like Catholicism, evangelicals, Islam are often tied to certain practices that can be oppressive and can be damaging to our sense of self.
Speak on it. I really identify with all of that. And to maybe go back to what you were saying about colonization, to you, what does a decolonized spirituality really look like?
Any decolonial process, whether it's one that's spirit based, which is where it's one about culture, where it's one about learning about your history, it has to be a process of unlearning. So again, in my teaching, my students are often brought through a process of unlearning the colonial nature of their sense of self. So, for example, I teach in the City University of New York system, which is predominated by students of color, and we have a lot of lecturing and engagement around the word minority, right? I try to unpack that word to get my students to no longer call themselves that, to call themselves students of color, the Reverend beautifully so was speaking about the different ways that people of Latin American descent have identified throughout the history of the US, where now we're embracing this Latinx term. So the same thing with spirituality. It is one that is very much rooted in an understanding that even our connection to God has been colonized. And I grew up in a Catholic home, as I said, and still to this day, I go to my mother's house and she has all these santos that are white and look nothing like her and nothing like us. A decolonized spirituality is also a politicized one, where we recognize that systems of oppression also rob us of our well-being. Connecting to a sense of ourselves as spiritual beings, we realize that filling our cup spiritually, whether it's meditating, whether it's yoga, connecting to nature, reading scripture, reading a very powerful and enlightening text, those are all political moves because they're a way that we reclaim our humanity in a system that has historically dehumanized us.
Griselda, talk to us a little bit about what you do at Brujas of Brooklyn, because your services are centered around wellness for women.
So Brujas of Brooklyn is specifically focused on womb wellness. And the reason why we were, in my opinion, and my sisters, we were led in a very spiritual way to this path is because our mother had a hysterectomy when we were very young. And we didn't understand much of what was going on. But in later in life and learning about reproductive health, we realized and we know statistically that Black women, women of African descent, and that includes Afro-Latinas, which my mother is one, um, they tend to have higher rates of fibroids and other issues that lead to a lot of reproductive imbalances. And when you look at the history of systems of slavery on this side of the world, like where my family is from, the Dominican Republic, a lot of people's wombs were used to produce human beings for profit. And as wretched as that sounds, and even though we can say, oh, slavery was so long ago, there's something called epigenetics, which is a science that says that genetically our DNA expression is altered and it is morphed when we suffer extreme forms of stress. And it's a school of thought that was birthed out of research done on Holocaust survivors. And what the biologists and epidemiologists realize is that 2 generations later, great grandchildren of Holocaust survivors had symptoms of PTSD in utero. So when you consider that Latinos, Latinx people come from a legacy of enslavement and indentured servitude, then we have that same genetic expression lodged in our bodies. So we decided to really focus on reclaiming that power of womb wellness because not only of this history, it's not just a wretched one. When it comes to the body, the womb is a space that, in an energetic sense, with regards to chakras, which are energy centers, carries a lot of creative energy. So this is the place for people that have wombs that we tap into to envision better worlds. We're in, Andrea, you spoke about it earlier, we're in the crux of a revolution, of an uprising, and we need visionaries. And if we're ill and our bodies are not vital, then we don't have the biological capacity to be able to be creative. So this and many other reasons are why the Brujas of Brooklyn have chosen to focus our work on womb wellness.
Griselda, we have so much more to talk to you about. We'll be back with you after the break. No se me vayan. This is Maria. Welcome back to Maria, amigos. I'm your host, Maria Cardona, and I'm here with my co-host, Andrea Mares, and with Dr. Griselda Rodríguez-Solomon of Brujas of Brooklyn. Andrea, I know you had a question for Griselda.
Yes, Griselda. So earlier you mentioned the concept of genetics, right? And how much information is stored from our ancestors. And something that I've kind of like navigated, right, is the fact that I'm most likely mixed. I have a lot of Aztec Mexica blood in me, but I probably also have Spaniard blood in me, right? And so how do you navigate your magic, your teaching when you're working with somebody, say, from Spain versus somebody from Mexico, right? And is there a difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is something that we are conscious of, that when we engage with people from different backgrounds, base level, the magic remains the same. We come with an open heart, we come from a place of generosity, but we also know that when we're working with someone who is of indigenous or African descent in particular, we try to be clear on the fact that we are engaging with a person that has experience, whether in this lifetime or intergenerationally, levels of trauma that lead us to address the work or the workshop in a way that may not necessarily be the case for somebody that is of more European descent. And this hasn't necessarily been very clear cut because our collectives have been so diverse, but they have been predominated by those who identify like BIPOC, Black and Indigenous people of color. So our work has been predominantly around addressing forms of these intergenerational traumas that we just spoke about.
Griselda, you heard the conversation that we had with Reverend Luis Cortez, and he talked about the connection that he has always had between his religion and politics. Do you see the same thing in your practice?
My identity as a bruja itself is a political act because of Black feminist traditions, especially Audre Lorde, that has taught me that the person was political. So a lot of the choices that, let's say, Latinos, Latinx communities have in the US are very much rooted in how we're perceived, and that we are, generally speaking, still being perceived as not being worthy of having access to all forms of resources than our white counterparts. So when I claim myself as a Latina, a Latinx, a Black person, a woman, a mother, and I make certain choices, I understand that they're coming from a political landscape that doesn't necessarily value me fully. So my own humanity itself is a political act. I have not had an interest, or haven't necessarily seen niches in structured political environments where I find myself. And maybe that's where the shift and the movement is taking us, where people like us, people like myself, have to take up spaces in those more traditional political spaces. But I find that they can sometimes be very dehumanizing and very debilitating, because not only are we entering spaces where we're not fully seen as Latinx people, as women, if you're queer, if you're an immigrant, but then we're like defending our communities. I just see that my existence itself is political, and my work as a bruja of Brooklyn with my sister really allows people, women in particular, to feel seen and validated so that then they can step into their fullness unapologetically and politicize their existence.
And part of this revolution that we're seeing happen across the country, right, with BLM demonstrations, as well as the Dapple pipe being shut down.
Absolutely.
And it's a huge win for the Cheyenne Sioux River tribe, right? So my question to you is, how has Mother Earth, right? How has nature and conservation and this connection with the natural world really influenced your magic? And I know being in a city, it's a little bit harder to access natural kind of resources and land, but for me, my spirituality is completely linked to Mother Earth.
My craft as a bruja is very much tied to nature, because there's a lot of data, there's a lot of information in nature, right? This is how our ancestors were able to cultivate food. This is how our ancestors were able to even navigation, right? There's tales of Christopher Columbus taking on African navigators from North Africa, the Moors, to help him navigate via the stars. I think that reclaiming nature is also a politicized act in a reality where the mainstream political system that we're under believes in an expendable earth where we can just consume natural resources and somehow they're going to be replenished. But ironically, under this COVID quarantine, when human beings were locked in, we saw nature regenerating itself. So that itself should tell you that human beings have been a virus of sorts for nature. And I think taking it deeper, living in a more urban setting like Brooklyn, New York, I'm very clear on, and I even teach on environmental racism, which is a profound aspect of anti-racist movements, to see across the nation communities of color, African American and Latinx ones, that is proportionally affected by environmental pollutants as opposed to our white counterparts. We live closer to like toxic waste sites. We live closer to radioactive sites. We live in food deserts. We have less access to fresh food, right? So all of this is tied into like this dynamic where our role as brujas again is a very political identity that we're taking on.
The only way that we are all ever going to realize that we actually have power is to have the confidence to express it. And one of the ways to do that is to go vote, right? Because that way we have the chance to actually choose who our leaders are. My question to you, Griselda, is when are we going to see the first bruja elected to Congress?
I mean, I intuitively, I'm like, there's probably a lot of undercover brujas already running because I think,
I think you're right.
because when we take the bruja identity outside of a spiritual context, generally speaking, a bruja is a person, a woman in particular, that is very much connected to her power and is unapologetic. And I see it with Cortez. She's somebody that I look at from the Bronx, and I'm like, yeah, she's a bruja to me, right? She may not identify in a spiritual sense, but she's fearless. She's
Maybe. Who
unapologetic. She
knows?
stands up to like bullies, and she's graceful. I think that we're, as a bruja, I'm also coming into my own power. Even so, even though I hold space for people to come into their own power, and this is never ending, where I'm realizing that, power doesn't always have to be masculine and dominant and in your face. Grace is a very powerful thing, right? Personally, for me, I think the political system in this country has to continue to shift. It's still an old boys club. We're seeing change with like Latinx people, Muslims, queer folks, trans folks, really stepping up and taking stands. But we're still living in an existence where old white men are the driving force, the vehicle that we're in.
Thank you so much, Griselda, for being here with us today and helping us dissect these critical issues. Your perspective is very valuable. Thank you for being on Maria.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Andrea.